Hello and welcome to the Political Dispatch, the podcast that explores the now in context. My name is Tom Spare.
I'm Lily Mudd.
And I'm Sid Kurapati. As we come to the end of the year, we wanted to take a moment to pause, look back, and reflect on the moments that shaped the past 12 months.
It's been a year filled with surprises, challenges, and historic moments. On this podcast, we've covered elections, international conflicts, domestic policy reforms, political scandals, peace agreements, party conferences, and pretty much everything you could imagine.
So for this special year in review episode, each of us has chosen two events, moments, or political developments from the year that stood out, something that felt particularly significant in the wider political landscape. So I think we all took that in different ways, so I'm not going to pin it down too much. And I guess they're a little bit of a surprise as well. We each kind of kept it a little bit quiet, so it'll be news to us too.
I've not followed the rules whatsoever, so I've already shared my stories in advance, so I'm been marked down already. Yeah.
So here's what we're going to do. We'll go one by one, talk through why we chose it, and reflect on why it mattered. Then at the end of the episode, we'll each share our favorite episode we produced this year, whether because of the topic, the research, the guests, or just how much fun it was to make.
So Tom, you're up first. What moment from the year have you chosen? And like you said, you did cheat a little bit. So actually, I'm gonna say, tell us the moments that you've chosen.
I'm not following the rules again. Classic. So I've actually picked three. I'll try to be as quick as possible getting through these. The first is Sudan, which is the forgotten war and a humanitarian disaster, which is taking place and has been for a couple of years now. The second is the Supreme Court judgment on the meaning of sex in the Equality Act 2010, because that's going to have a lot of implications in the UK. And then the passing of Robert Redford, which might seem a bit obscure initially, but I'm going to explain a little bit why I think his passing is significant for particularly America, but also the wider sort of film community as well. So the crisis in Sudan. Sudan is the world's largest humanitarian crisis, and it's unfolding right now. It's been called the Forgotten War. As the UN health chief put it bluntly, I think race is in play here. In 2025, while the world's attention was elsewhere on conflicts such as in the genocide in Palestine and in the war in Ukraine, Sudan descended further into catastrophe. The civil war between Sudan's army, led by General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hamendi, has been raging since April 2023. There were the same two generals who staged a coup together in October 2021. So these are people that were partners, really, in the initial conflict. And then they couldn't agree on power sharing and turned their guns on each other. So the Rapid Support Force has its origins in a notorious militia group that committed genocide in Darfur 2 decades ago. And so there's sort of like a link through there. But in 2025, there was a whole sort of dramatic escalation. So in January, the United States officially determined that the RSF and allied militia have committed genocide. Former Secretary of State Antony Blinken said they systematically murdered men and boys, even infants, on an ethnic basis and deliberately target women and girls from certain ethnic groups for rape and other forms of brutal sexual violence. The US imposed sanctions on both generals. Interestingly, their response to what Israel is getting up to is very different. So the country has made a particular stand on that, and then elsewhere there's contradicting approaches. And then in March, the army recaptured Khartoum after 2 years of RSF control. But the capital was basically a burnt-out shell, government buildings, hospitals destroyed, the airport, a sort of graveyard of smashed planes. And when it reopened to domestic flights in October, the opening was delayed because there were drone strikes nearby. Basically, the whole country is very much sort of remains on edge and in huge amounts of damage. In June, the RSF seized control of the territory along Sudan's border with Libya, and Egypt. So a strategic breakthrough that opened up new weapon smuggling routes. And in October, Al Fashar, the last major urban centre in Darfur, held by the army, fell to the RSF after an 18-month siege. So in November, the RSF formed a rival government. So Sudan is splitting for the second time, with South Sudan ceding in 2011, which I think has become the newest country. There might have been another country that's followed since. But so already we've seen lots of secessions, even in a short space of time. And the numbers are truly staggering. So in 2 years or 2.5 years, more than 150,000 people have died. Over 14 million people have been displaced, more than a quarter of Sudan's population. And 21 million, so 45% of the country, face acute food insecurity. And whole regions are in famine. Fewer than 25% of hospitals are operational. Cholera spread this year, over 123,000 cases and 3,500 deaths from that alone. And 10 million children are out of school. And then on top of this, the Trump administration, when it took office, cut aid as well. So his aid cuts forced 1,100 emergency food kitchens, which is almost 80% of them, to shut down. The World Food Programme now says that more than 24 million people face acute food insecurity, and peace talks have failed repeatedly in 2025. The RSF announced in November it had agreed to a humanitarian truce, but the army refused, accusing them of never respecting the ceasefires. And the international crisis group called Diplomatic Efforts lackluster. Amnesty International labelled the world's response woefully inadequate. Both sides continue receiving weapons from foreign backers. So Amnesty International has documented arms from Serbia, Russia, China, Turkey, and the UAE reaching the RSF. And the UK came under fire after allegations that British-made weapons were ending up in RSF hands. With the RSF forming its own government and neither side willing to compromise, Sudan is fracturing. And 2025 has proved one thing definitely, that the world isn't paying attention to the largest humanitarian crisis ever recorded. So guys, any sort of reflections on that at all?
I just think it's really good that you walked us through that, Tom, because I do think we really have not talked about it. And I think that it's definitely important that we talk about it. And I've seen so little in the media. So I think I'm glad that you brought this up, Tom, even though it's horrifying. And I'm glad that you were able to walk us through it in this way. And yeah, I really appreciate that. So those are my thoughts.
I mean, I echo what Lily's saying, but I just want to add that it's strange how when you have a major conflict that's happening in the global north, you have multiple conflicts that emerge in the global south and they never get covered by major news media organizations across the world. Even if they are, it's a mere lip service, and it just shows the difference in the value of life that exists in the global north compared to the global south. It's extremely sad. It's not surprising, and it's nothing new. But you would expect that something like this happening in the 80s would surely be limited by the technology at that point in time. But we're in the 21st century, in the 2020s right now, and it seems like we're still plagued by the same issues, and the media is still refusing to highlight things based on humanitarian need, but on strategic interests. So that's what I think.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, the media has presented Africa as a continent, in Western media anyway, very poorly, not representing it very fairly. And even like when it's not me trying to be flippant or anything, but I was on a walk and listening to some Christmas music, and Feed the World comes on by Live Aid. And it's just this whole thing of like presenting Africa as this desolate, there's no water anywhere. No one's, got any food or anything like that. And I think in the West, we have this perception that, well, these things just happen and it's not a shock really. Whereas war happening in Europe. Oh, we couldn't possibly ever imagine that happening, and that it is so shocking. So I think there's like a contrast there, that there's some inbuilt biases that exist. To something very different, but something sort of closer to home, the UK's Supreme Court judgment on the meaning of sex in the Equality Act 2010. So on April the 16th, the UK Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land, unanimously said on the terms that woman and sex in the Equality Act refers only to biological sex, not to acquired gender, even with a gender recognition certificate. So this means that a transgender woman under the Equality Act cannot be referred to as a woman. The case was brought by For Women Scotland, which was backed by J.K. Rowling, challenging Scottish legislation allowing trans women with gender recognition certificates to sit on public boards reserved for women. So it's actually something that's quite removed from everyday life. You know, the idea of trans people sitting on public boards, quite a niche area for this something like this to happen. And 2 Scottish courts have rejected their arguments before it reached the Supreme Court. The judgment reversed 20 years of understanding, and since the Gender Recognition Act in 2004, someone with a gender recognition certificate was legally recognised as that gender for all purposes, so for all elements of life. And the Supreme Court fundamentally overturned that interpretation. Lord Hodge, the court's deputy president, was clear: while the word biological doesn't appear in the Equality Act definition of man or woman, the ordinary meaning of those plain and unambiguous words corresponds with the biological characteristics that make an individual a man or a woman. The court's reasoning centered on workability. How could you maintain women-only spaces if women included biological males with certificates that are confidential and cannot be asked about? Service providers running changing rooms, homeless hostels, medical services would face the insurmountable practical difficulties. The court examined provision relating to pregnancy and maternity discrimination, single-sex services, communal accommodation and sport, concluding these could only function coherently with a biological definition of sex. Crucially, the judgment emphasised that trans people remain protected under the Equality Act through separate protected characteristic of gender reassignment, but not through the protected characteristic of sex. So the Supreme Court's decision basically says that trans people are protected in another element of the law, but they just can't be recognised as women. If they're trans, they can't be recognised as women in the eyes of the law. The effect emerged slowly, so most organisations are waiting for updated guidance from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which still hasn't officially published 7 months later. But in December, 2 of Britain's most notable women's organisations announced that they could no longer include trans women. So Girl Guiding, which oversees 385,000 girls in rainbows, brownies, guides and rangers, announced with a heavy heart that trans girls would no longer be able to join. And the Women's Institute, the WI, which has welcomed trans women for over 40 years, said it had no other choice but to restrict membership to biological women from April 2026. Both organisations emphasised that they didn't want to make these changes, and the WI CEO, Melissa Green, said she'd shared 40 years of fellowship and sisterhood with trans women. Girl Guiding said the decision would have been a decision they would prefer not to make. But as legally recognised women's organisations and charities, they felt compelled to comply with the ruling or face costly legal challenges from gender-critical campaigners. And that's something that I've sort of sensed a lot more, that gender-critical campaigners are getting a lot more funding now. They're becoming much better organised, and they're proving to be a real thorn in a lot of organisations' sides, and they're just not willing to have that legal as well as a PR battle and get drawn into what many consider a culture war. But I don't see it that way personally. I think these are human beings at the end of the day, and they've been excluded. The WI announced it would create sisterhood groups alongside Women Institute to maintain trans-inclusive spaces. I listened to an interview with the CEO of WI, and the presenter asked, have you actually received any complaints from members? And she said, we've had 62 correspondents from across an organization of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. And I don't really understand. If you haven't had any resistance for it, why are you making this judgment before you get the guidance is my question. Trans rights groups called it devastating. Helen Belcher of the Trans Actual said organizations were being forced to exclude trans people against the organization's will and at great costs. They've reported trans people avoiding public spaces altogether, fearing being challenged or outed. Some raised concerns about enforcement. Will organizations police toilets and changing rooms? How would biological sex be verified? The ruling doesn't affect membership organization. It touches sport, the armed services, hospitals, women-only charities, changing rooms, and more. 7 months on, Britain is still grappling with what this judgment means in practice. And the Supreme Court said this isn't a victory for one side over the other, but I would say if, gender critical groups have been really empowered by this, and I would say it's changed the balance a bit. Any thoughts there?
I think it's so interesting because this is what my dissertation was Mumsnet as a space for gender critical feminism. And so a lot of the research that I had to do outside of Mumsnet was about the sentiment and kind of the environment that this conversation was taking place in a wider scale. And that was only 2 years ago when we were writing our dissertations, right? 2 years or a year and a half. And it was so different. I feel like when I was doing my research then, I think that there was much less going on around this discussion. And of course, it's been happening for years. I'm not going to say that it wasn't happening then. J.K. Rowling was still saying a lot of the things that she's been saying for a while. Obviously, she's been a very strong advocate for gender critical feminism. But I think the fact that it's coming now is so indicative of the tides shifting across the world with a lot of this and these culture wars that are taking place, and the idea of diverting attention from other things, I think this is case in point. There's always these specific issues that come up when politicians want other things to take a back seat. And I think that's this right now. This is the trans issue, and I'm going to put that in quotes because I think there's so many things that we have to discuss within this issue. In the US, it's trans people playing sports. That's what we talk about a lot. And I think here it's more about the actual intellectual definition of a woman and what that means in practice. So women-only spaces, and the arguments might be different, but I think that they're used in the same way. And it's really frustrating to me personally to see this because I think there's so many other things that are happening right now. And of course, this is what stirs up the rhetoric, and this is what makes people frustrated, which, yeah, anyways, that's my own personal take. But I could probably rant for a while longer about this. As someone who had to comb through gender critical feminist posts, like hundreds of them on Mumsnet, it's really frustrating to me to see this coming back in force a year and a half later. So anyways, I'll leave it at that. But Sid, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I'll just pick up from where you kind of ended, that this is, it symbolizes the change in the tide. And I suppose the petition that was placed in front of the United Kingdom Supreme Court would have been to just figure out what the definition is. The thing with that is, like, we've had similar petitions that have been filed in the Supreme Court here in India as well, where they stick to what has been, asked of the court, and so that, but that then gets interpreted and covered in the media in a very different way, right? So if the people on both sides, I would say, if the people are, expecting that the Supreme Court is going to go ahead and define everything and is also going to come up with mitigating measures and safeguards for the trans community, that's not going to happen. It's a rare situation. I don't agree with, the way the definitions being worded out, but it's for the government to go ahead and take legislative action. here and to set the norms straight. You can't have the judiciary kind of doing the job what the government has to do. And that's something which I see in India as well, a lot. So it's really empowered the far right, people who don't understand the complexities of gender and sex, who are unwilling to do their research and to try and get to know more about why this is important. And I'm sure there's going to be further victories for the LGBTQ community as time progresses and as the understanding of society increases.
Yeah. No, I know trans folks, and I've met them particularly through the Iris Film Festival and hearing a lot of films and stories by trans filmmakers and storytellers. I think your point is really important, Lily, that this is being used as a way of a distracting technique, really, to take energy away from people who would probably be otherwise very critical of how their own policies are impacting others. And to target minorities is just a classic way of distracting techniques. But I think, most people probably don't realize they've had interactions with trans people. And yeah, I just feel like it's such I still can't process it really. And I feel like the judgment is incredibly disappointing and is, again, rewarding the people that shout the loudest. Yeah, it was quite a dark day, I think, for the LGBTQ plus community. I hope that things turn around and other policies come in place to protect the trans community, but it's difficult to see at the moment. But my final story that I wanted to cover was the death of Robert Redford. So I've chosen his passing, which happened on the 16th of September. And I know some might be thinking, why is this a political moment? But Redford's death marked the end of an era that fundamentally shaped how we think about power, accountability, and the role of journalism in democracy. So Robert Redford died at 89 at his home in Utah. Meryl Streep called him one of the lions. Jane Fonda said he stood for an America we have to keep fighting for. And Leonardo DiCaprio called him an incredible environmentalist and a hero to a lot of us. That's what makes Robert Redford's legacy so distinct politically. He wasn't content just to be a movie star. He used his platform to champion causes that tell stories that challenged power. The origin story of All the President's Men, which was made in 1976, shows Redford's political instincts at work. In July 1972, he just finished filming The Candidate, itself a sharp commentary on American politics. The studio set up a promotional whistle-stop train ride through Florida. Other candidates were on board the train or were taking a similar train route. And there used to be this tradition where the candidates would sort of get on trains and go across the whole of America. Redford would get off at each stop and tell crowds that he had absolutely nothing to say, and then he'd get back on the train and then go to the next stop. And there were thousands of people were coming to see this fictional candidate, and Robert Redford showed up, did a peace sign, and then went back on the train, and the train went off again. Between stops, he chat to the political press corps. This was weeks after the Watergate break-in, and Redford asked about it. Were they Cubans? What happened? The reporters smiled knowingly. They suspected something bigger and connected it to the White House. But when Redford pushed, they gave him a lecture. Both parties do dirty tricks. Nixon's going to win a landslide, and nobody wants to get on the wrong side of him. I don't know if that sounds familiar in the current political climate. Redford went home very cynical. He watched the papers, and sure enough, there was nothing. Then suddenly this little thing appeared with a dual byline he didn't recognize. Just two guys, and it grew. Every few days, another story. Always the same two reporters, Woodward and Bernstein. Redford became a cheering section of one, watching these unknown journalists do what the rest of the press wouldn't. In 1976, 2 years after Nixon's resignation, Redford brought the Watergate story to the screen. But here's what's remarkable. He didn't wait for the book. He approached Woodward and Bernstein when they were still in the thick of it, still being attacked by the White House. The studios didn't want to make the film. They thought America was done with Watergate. The Washington Post was terrified that Hollywood would screw it up. And Catherine Graham, who was the editor at the time, literally begged Redford not to use the paper's name. But Redford persisted because he saw something underneath, the process of investigative journalism, the unglamorous work of knocking on doors, checking sources, living with doubt. What makes All the President's Men politically significant isn't just that it immortalized Woodward and Bernstein as journalists. It showed that journalism as a check on power, not glamorous, but essential. At a time when we're debating fake news and media bias, that film's message resonates today. No one is above the law, and we need a free press willing to pursue the truth. But Redford's political impact went far beyond one film. In 1981, he founded the Sundance Institute, democratizing storytelling, giving voices to people the Hollywood system had ignored. And by 1985, he transformed a struggling film festival into the future launching pad for people like Steven Soderbergh, Ryan Coogler, Quentin Tarantino, Chloe Zhao. Films that premiered at Sundance include Get Out, Precious, Manchester by the Sea. These weren't just sort of entertainment. They challenged audiences to confront uncomfortable truths. The director, Richard Linklater, said, "I can't think of another person who had the impact on filmmaking world in the way that Redford did." And then his environmentalism. So Redford was the original actor as environmentalist. And he sort of blocked a lot of highway developments and power plants across the state. And for 5 decades, he was a trustee of the Natural Resources Defense Council. One of his biographers said that Redford was born with a hard eye. He could always see what was wrong, which gave him a dark view of life looking at his own country. But that darkness drove him to action. He didn't just play characters who challenged authority. He founded institutions that amplified dissenting voices. When we talk about celebrity activism today, we're often cynical. Redford's life offers a model. He put his money and his reputation on the line consistently for decades, often at personal cost. He poured his earnings into Sundance, into supporting independent filmmakers, into protecting wild spaces. And at the LBJ Library in 2012, Redford said something that has stayed with me. He talked about how America doesn't seem to learn from its own history, how it keeps repeating the same mistakes, how what gets threatened is always the Constitution and the rule of law. And he said, "I never dreamed that it would slide so far off the back end." That sense of disappointment that journalism has devolved, that money and competition have replaced the ethic of truth-telling, that's the tragedy of Redford's final years. But his death this year reminds us what we've lost and what we need to fight for. In an era of deep fakes and attacks on the press, Redford's legacy is a call to action. Support independent voices, demand accountability from the powerful, tell stories that matter, and never stop questioning whether you're being shown the truth. As Redford himself said, we keep being told things where the truth is underneath. Our job as citizens, as journalists, as storytellers, is to dig for it. There we go.
Nice, Tom. That was wonderful. Sid, your turn. You get to follow that. So
It's tough to follow that one. Exceptionally well written, Tom, and it's almost like a perfect ode to Redford and what he stood for. Yeah, that was pretty amazing. I genuinely don't have anything to add. Just thought he was amazing in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. I loved that movie.
Well, that's the thing. I didn't even mention the incredible films he was in. But
Yeah.
Such a varied career.
Sid, do you want to share your events now?
Sure. So I think I'll stick to one event. I think what's really stood out for me, it's not a particular event per se, but just a general degradation of democracy in India and how it's just deteriorating on a daily basis. I think there's just, I could give like 100 examples of what that is, but a few examples which I can definitely go on is at a government level, at a citizen level, and at a freedom of speech level, right? So if I look at the government level, I think the institutions, there are countless examples of the institutions falling apart. The most recent one is almost like the last bastion of democracy is the Election Commission of India, which people have been raising serious doubts over, especially the leader of opposition, with detailed presentations telling how different places new voters have emerged out of nowhere, how you had 500 people registered on one address and they've all voted for a single party, how the election commission has empowered itself to do revise voter rolls and has eliminated people in a recent election from the voting rolls, from the lists, and how the election commission, instead of taking the concerns of the opposition seriously on what they're raising, are actually filing cases against the opposition parties and kind of saying that, where's the proof? You show us where the proof is. And the ruling party decides to go ahead and hit the opposition, saying that, you can't question the election commission and all of that. I'm being purposely a little vague in terms of names and examples, but it is quite shocking. And then the news media's role in all of this is to go ahead and amplify genuine concerns with proof that the opposition leader has provided. But instead, what they do is they go ahead and mock the opposition outright across different languages, across social media, and so on. So it kind of makes me think as to, you want a constructive opposition, and the opposition's being constructive over here. They're raising questions on the election commission, and with legitimate documents. From what I've seen, it's ridiculous that the system is just turned on them completely, and people are unaware, or they're very nonchalant about the whole thing. That's the state of democracy, I would say, from a government perspective. From a citizen's perspective, you have stand-up comedians who are persecuted on a regular basis in India, who are critical of the government, who crack jokes on the government or on the ruling party or on, the prime minister, or on their statements and their beliefs, despite having constitutional provisions to go ahead and do so, in the sense that there's freedom of speech, there's Article 19A, which allows them to speak their mind, and so on. And people like Kunal Kamra, multiple others, are generally persecuted. And then what they do is, not just will they attack the performer, they'll also attack the venue, and they'll kind of destroy the venue, physically damage the venue. And that kind of makes it, if you perform in those venues, they will be like, we're going to create financial distress for you. You don't get permissions to host events in states where the ruling party is in power, and you have open threats to people who are critical. So it's just pretty ridiculous. I was in a different city recently, and I had attended an event in the evening, like a public gathering by the riverside, and there were open calls for making India a Hindu-only state. And they were not just one, but there were two, and they're speaking in they're on loudspeakers. They are openly calling for, India being a Hindu country, Hindu-only country, that we have a religion that is the dominant religion, should be the religion of the state. The blatant nature of how these things are being said, and how the general public around me was cheering for it, is staggering. This is not the India that I grew up in. This is not the society that I grew up in. This is not my country. Like, this is not how my country is. And then you have the sheer stupidity that exists in the political class. I'm currently in the national capital, and we have an AQI which is at a hazardous level. I've been running air purifiers inside my home because I can afford it. But, we have an AQI of 500 at this point in time. It's like smoking 30 cigarettes a day. And the chief minister of the state of Delhi says that AQI is a temperature and that we can go ahead and control it. So to fudge the figures, what they started doing was they started watering the air around the AQI monitors, the government AQI monitors, which reports what the levels are, so that the figures are actually lower. And people actually caught them doing that. And now we're at such a state that an international T20 match was cancelled in a different city because of poor air quality, which is another shame. But the real shame is that this is what the people voted for. This is what you get when you vote for people who have no idea what to do, who have only blamed the opposition for everything, and who want to do 10-hour debates on the national song because it's the 150th anniversary of the national song of India, instead of coming to a solution on the air quality that is affecting everybody. To the credit of the opposition, they kind of said that, let's not make this an ideological battle. Let's make this is a health crisis. So you want to work together on this. And yet the government they're implementing measures which are not really creating any positive change, any improvements. And people who have actually gone out onto the streets, who actually protested, have been hit with water cannons, or, the police has kind of rounded them up. So this is not new. This has happened in the past as well in India when we've had a different government. But just the blatant nature of how it is and the sheer apathy that we see in society, in the government, on keeping the people first is staggering. So yeah, it's definitely quite concerning as to how things are shaping up. I hope it reaches a crescendo, because it will. And that's the thing about political waves and people who are in power for too long, that people reach a saturation point. But it's just that the institutional credibility and the erosion of democratic values and the ethos of diversity that's getting affected, that is being eroded over the last 11 years. The society has changed. We've become very agitated and very confrontational as a people, which is really bad. But being a cautiously optimistic person, there is an idea of India that still exists and will persist. And that democracy will always be there.
That was a good way to end on a positive note, with the note of a little bit of scariness about it getting worse. But I like that you ended on a positive note. Tom, did you want to add anything?
Is there anything that has really changed the dial this year in particular? Have things got particularly worse in 2025, or is it just sort of a continuation? And what's the acronym you were referring to, by the way? Because I wasn't familiar with that, about air quality.
It's the Air Quality Index, the AQI. So WHO prescribes a particular set of norms and certain levels which are considered safe, healthy, critical, unhealthy. I mean, whatever. I'm saying these in random order right now, but like people can of course figure that out. And there's something called hazardous. But the government of India made a statement saying that we don't prescribe to WHO rules. We'll have our own levels, which is...
invent their own levels of health.
Yeah, exactly. As they do for a lot of other things like Human Development Index. They were like, oh, we don't believe in the passport index that exists. We don't go by that. But we are very proud to say that we are a $4 trillion economy, which has been, of course, a metric that is a measurement by the Western countries that's come up originally. Very happy to accept that. But we're not, When it's critical, we're just going to say that, you keep your rules to yourself. Let us decide what we want to, which is a very arrogant and egotistical way of looking at things.
In 2025, is there any particular jumps that you've seen in?
So the whole election commission thing is 2025. It is we've had some amount of, especially after the last general election that took place in 2024, some faith was kind of restored on how things were done, at least based on the outcome. There is a certain level of unbiasedness. But once the investigation was done by the principal opposition party, the Congress, on how the election commission has operated and where they picked out multiple seats where there were massive discrepancies, 20,000 people being added to the rolls, and so on and so forth. And you have a house address which is 0, or a cinema hall that's been registered as a residence or something of that sort. Really outrageous stuff, which has not been cross-verified. So the veracity of the data that's been presented by the election commission is being questioned, and the integrity of the election commission is being questioned massively. And these are particularly in states where either the BJP wants to come into power or they're already in power. So they're kind of picking and choosing certain states where these discrepancies have come up. And I kind of changed my algorithm on Instagram just to see how many different people are talking about this. There has been an increase in that sense where people have been like, hey, this is going crazy now. But at the ground level, outside the metropolitans, where people actually vote in the rural areas, which form the main crux of the voting population, these issues need to reach them as well. And the news media doesn't play its part, and it really makes it difficult for the opposition to function, because there is no level playing field anymore, which is one of the basic foundations of any democracy. It's not just about doing elections. It's about doing free and fair elections. It's about including the opposition in governance through a parliamentary system that has existed since independence. And the government, the ruling parties kind of reduced the whole idea of democracy as we do elections successfully, which is crap. And yeah, it's just anything and everything, the most absurdist things are happening in politics at this point in time in India. So it's quite sad in that sense to see how things are shaping up. But I hope that it's reaching a crescendo, a critical point where the tide will start turning. And it reminds me of George Bush's faux pas. It's really difficult to see a tide turn. Is that it? Did I really say that? Anyway.
That was an uncanny impression there, Sid.
I think it's interesting, Sid, that you were kind of saying that these are all issues that are getting worse, because I think my issue that I want to talk about is something that's been horrible and just continues to be horrible. I was going to talk about AI earlier in this, but I think I'm going to focus on this because I think this fits really well with what you were saying. I think it's the opposite, Sid, where this has been an institutionalized problem in the US and we have done nothing about it. And it's not necessarily getting worse, but it's just continued to be a problem. So yeah, there's no real other segue I can do to talk about this. So unfortunately, just going to have to dive right in. But gun violence continues to be a major public safety and political issue in 2025, particularly in the US, where I'm going to focus because I think other countries are doing much better to curb this type of violence. But this issue has been something that I personally have been invested in for a long time because being from Colorado, I'm from right down the road from Columbine. So growing up with the legacy of Columbine very much in our minds and in our textbooks and, knowing about what happened at Columbine from a very young age, I think it's something that a lot of Colorado young people in particular have had to deal with. Of course, now it's everywhere, but I think when I was growing up and I was very young, that was still something that I probably knew more about than other young people. But then as I got older, I actually worked as an intern at the Brady Center to Prevent Gun Violence. So I learned more about why gun violence happens in the US and like the actual strategy that can be done to curb it. So I think I became less emotionally invested, well, not less emotionally invested, but tied the emotional investment to logic and understanding deeper about the issue. But in 2025, there have been 230 school shooting incidents. And I'm going to focus specifically on school shootings because I think that this is, for me, the most frustrating and devastating part of all of this. So there's been 230 school shootings, which is less than last year. So that is a good thing. But I think 230 is a staggeringly high number. And then in September, when Charlie Kirk was fatally shot at Utah Valley University in Orem, Utah, that was what made a lot of the headlines. But on the same day, there was a shooting at my old high school where my dad teaches. And I spoke about this with him on an episode of Be the Change podcast as well. But I think that that was really horrifying because there's this real sense in the US that it couldn't happen to us, but at the same time, it almost feels like you're waiting for it to happen, which I think is such a strange situation to be in, especially when you're thinking about the stakes of an incident of mass violence. I think it's so scary to have that balance all the time in your head. And so many young people across the US have either been victims of gun violence or survived school shootings, or they've been involved in a scare. Like, of course, this 230 number doesn't reflect all of the threats that come into schools and the drills that we have to do and the situations that psychologically we're put in these situations of being in a shooting or being in a situation where you have to react that way. So anyways, when it actually did happen at Evergreen High School in Evergreen, Colorado, I think it was so terrifying. And it really, for me, it's not like I hadn't been learning about gun violence and like advocating for the issue here and there. But I think when it actually is your own personal situation, it became so much worse. And that shouldn't be the case necessarily. But I think the really frustrating part of all of this is shootings happen and they're in the news for a day and then they kind of fall out of the headlines. And that's that. Unless there's something like the Charlie Kirk shooting, for example, where, of course, there was lots of political conversations around his assassination. And I mean, we could definitely dive into that more as a huge political turning point as well, because I think there was lots of headlines and things that were said that were really concerning, especially by President Trump, I will say. But when you just think about this whole issue in the US, it's just this constant stream of headlines and these events happening and nothing happening. So I think, Sid, that's why I'm saying, I guess this kind of tees up my event, because where it feels like there's an escalation in some of these political issues in India, there's just been this constant horrifying reality in the US, which is, yeah, for me, I guess just personally was very highlighted this year, because once you've been in a situation like that, or, you know, your loved ones have been in a situation, you pay a lot more attention to those headlines, but that shouldn't be the case. Anyways, I digress. But I think more recently, on December 13th, there was a mass shooting that occurred at Brown University. And one of my really close friends goes there, and they're in their final exam period, and she's a med student. And so I automatically started thinking if she was, you know, at the hospital and was, you know, seeing this scene unfolding, which was so scary. And thankfully she was in lockdown and she's okay. But 2 students were killed and 9 were injured. And I think it's just so, I just wanted to raise this as my event, because it is something that we see in other parts of the world. Of course, in Australia, the horrible shooting that happened on December 14th at Bondi Beach. And this was a terrorist incident, so different than potentially some of these school shootings. But I think it's just frustrating because it is just this constant backdrop in the US of Congress not passing major federal legislation and not tightening gun laws despite so much violence taking place and this continuing to be an issue. And I think it speaks to the wider conversation of the causes of gun violence as well, which I think this leads to adolescence and maybe some of the conversations around mental health and loneliness in young people, which I think could also be an event that we could talk about as well. Just the conversations that have happened around, I mean, adolescence is a whole different discussion about whether you agree with it or not, about, you know, the political implications of that show. But I think it is a much wider conversation that we need to be having, and quickly. We need to be doing it faster because there are so many generations of young people that are growing up feeling isolated and feeling lonely despite being more connected than we've ever been before. And I think that gun violence is increasingly becoming a symptom of those situations, which is terrifying. And it's obviously the most horrible end of the spectrum that you could get to. But I did want to bring that up because I think it's a contrast, I guess, to some of the things that have been scaling. This is just something that's been very constant and something that should change. And I'm hoping that there will be steps to change it in 2026 and going forward. I think that there's lots that can be done, but it's just Congress actually taking that step, and we need actual widespread federal legislation. Otherwise, this isn't going to change. So that is my little rant. I could probably talk about this for days, so I'll stop there.
Just on that, the fact that, in America, credible gun legislation hasn't been passed since like 1994. Like the last ban on heavy assault weaponry, I think, was 1994, and that lasted for 10 years until 2004 and then wasn't renewed. And you can see spikes afterwards of like how more cases went up afterwards. And I remember watching a town hall event where Obama was near the end of his presidency, and he was talking about gun safety because obviously there was some very famous and notable shootings in schools when he was president. And basically a guy stands up and says to the president, "Why are you taking my guns off me?" Sort of thing. And he made this very eloquent argument talking about the safety of cars. When cars first were invented, there wasn't a speed limit on the highways and there wasn't any seatbelts. But as time passed, you realised that wasn't safe for the people that were using them. And over time, we just accept that there's speed limits and we accept that there's, safety belts in cars. You don't need an assault rifle to go hunting. You don't need an assault rifle to keep yourself safe and your family safe if you live in a rural community. So, yeah, I just thought it's one of the most eloquent arguments for having extra safety.
I have a slightly different take on the thing, like in the sense, the kind of safety regulation which Obama proposed back then or other democratic governments have tried to do have honestly been nothing but lip service. They don't really, because they know that they're going to lose out on constituents. They'll lose elections and so on and so forth. I mean, you need like really stringent laws to go ahead and regulate the sale of guns and the distribution of guns. And unfortunately, that just doesn't happen in the United States. It's one of the most baffling, amendments to the United States Constitution, which I've never got my head around as to why does this happen. I was reading something some time back, and I just wanted to check if I remember it correctly. So in 2021, the leading cause of death in children and adolescents in the United States is gun violence. It's not a health issue. It's not something else. It used to be car crashes, but it's not that anymore. It is gun violence. And, you got children dying. The government is still kind of standing by the Second Amendment. It's quite ridiculous. And like, I think there should be some sort of a wake up. I mean, the wake up calls have always been there in the United States too. But I think if I'm not wrong, Colorado is a state which has actually taken really active steps to kind of reduce gun violence of some sort, especially this year. And they're imposing new security and oversight requirements for gun shows and whatnot and everything. But there has to be some sort of a model state that needs to implement it and show the country that it can be done and show the numbers for it, and then say that, go ahead and implement it on a nationwide level. It can't be that you can't do this. Like, it just can't be.
No, it's crazy. I do think that the tricky part in the US is that guns are just so embedded in like our lives and our culture. And I think that that's what makes this so difficult. And I do think that that's why a lot of recent activism has been talking about, it's not necessarily, it's the sale, of course, But I think then you start to think about things like ghost guns, where you can order the parts and you can put them together yourselves, which is how a lot of young people are getting them. Really difficult to curb that. But the other part of this is the actual safety of having guns in your home, because that's the other way that a lot of young people are having access. And the other thing with this is that some of those numbers of gun deaths are actually suicides as well. So this is something that people are saying, if you have a gun in your home, you need to have proper safety mechanisms. Of course, if it's for self-defense, that's what a lot of Americans say that they have their guns for, which is understandable based off of our history. And I don't agree with this, but people's perspectives. And I think it's just, you need to have proper gun safes, and you need to have them in places where kids can't access them, because obviously that's where we start to see, and I guess I'm focusing mostly on school shootings, with school shootings in particular. It is preventable to actually make sure that your guns can't get into people's hands. It's preventable. There are lots of organizations that are advocating for it. So lots of different approaches, lots of different solutions. It's just, let's do some of them, one of them, any of them,
Yeah, it kind of reminded me of a quote which is said about communal riots in India. If a riot happens in India, in any city or in any town, it's either because of the incompetence of the government or because of government backing. So it can be prevented, it can be solved. It's just that in most cases, it's the political will that is always lacking. So yeah, I just hope that there's some safeguards that are presented, or some really stringent laws are implemented to kind of safeguard children. Let's just safeguard children.
Yeah, but let's end on a more positive note. Favorite episodes? Does anybody want to kick us off?
I was going to break the rules again. I will pick one, and then it'd be interesting to hear what you guys think. Right at the start of the year, we did an episode about Jimmy Carter, and I think it was a really good example of like the change in America at the time, because obviously President Trump was coming in for his second term, and it was just at the end of Biden's presidency. Carter, for anyone that doesn't know, President of the United States, I think 39th President of the United States, and only served one term in the late 70s after, there's Watergate in the 70s, a sort of distrust. And he was a peanut farmer that then became a lieutenant in a submarine, and then went into politics and became President of the United States. Past, pretty modest achievements in the White House, but it was post-presidency that his success really kicked off. Monitored hundreds of elections and did a lot of research into cutting down on deadly diseases. And Biden said of Carter, for anyone in search of what it means to live a life of purpose and meaning, the good life, study Jimmy Carter, a man of principle, faith and humility. The previous year I'd been to the US in the lead up to the elections, went to the Carter Presidential Center, and just was really inspired about the idea of service and serving your community and your country, and what was a good way to start 2025.
Sid, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I had a real fun episode which we did this year, and it was written by our very own Mr. Spare. It was the politics of Star Wars. I thought that was such a fun episode. My God, we had a riot recording that. If people would know how much we laughed during it. It was such a fun episode. The anecdotes that you added, the context that you put the present in with, giving an example of how the underdog kind of comes back and takes the establishment, challenges the establishment. I thought it was a really quirky, a really witty way of writing. It was a very well written episode, Tom. And I thought that was one of my favorite episodes. I have another favorite episode, actually. I don't know if Lily's going to say it.
Okay. I think that my favorite, because I am going to see him tomorrow, and it would be... I took it. Sid just made a little motion for everybody listening that was Sid's second one, but I would be sad to not give him a little shout out on this. I think that it was wonderful to have my dad on our podcast when we did our Lessons in Democracy episode, because I don't think that we've done a podcast episode together before this. And I think that it was so interesting to see him on like the other side. And of course, I've seen him teaching, and he's my dad, so I've talked with him lots, but getting to see him in his element while we're kind of listening and asking him questions, I think that it was really wonderful. And it took me right back to when I was in his classroom when I was like 14 and then 18 when I had him. So yeah, I thought that was really cool. And I do think that he did share a lot of hope. And I think we need lots of that. We've talked about that a lot on this podcast. And I think that he's a really wonderful person to listen to when you need a little bit of light. He always reminds me, all this is cyclical and it's going to come back around, and we're doing the best that we can. We're fighting the good fight, and that's really all that we can do. So I thought that was wonderful. And I'd love to do more interview episodes as well in 2026, because I think we've gotten to have some very cool conversations with people throughout this year.
It was my list as well, and I wasn't going to pick it as number one because I thought I had to defer to you, Lily. Can't take that glory.
Yeah, that was such a good episode, and I was in that classroom sitting right next to you. I was literally like, okay, what can I ask him next now? This is so much fun. Yeah, such an amazing person to talk to. Such a positive energy. Loved it. Loved that episode. Merry Christmas to him.
Yeah, exactly. Merry Christmas. We'll link all of these in the description so people can check them out easily if you would like to. I feel like we ended on a good note of hope with some of that.
Yeah.
Might be a good place for us to wrap up.
Let's bottle up the hope and keep it for 2026.
Yeah. Well, that brings us to the end of our special year in review episode of the Political Dispatch.
Thank you so much for joining us throughout the year, whether you've listened to every episode or just discovered the show. Your support means so much to us and helps us keep exploring the stories that shape our politics and the world around us.
You can find all of our episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Please like, subscribe, and share the show if you enjoyed it. Every bit of support helps us grow and keep these conversations going.
My name is Tom Spare.
I'm Lily Mott.
And I'm Sid Kurapati. You've been listening to the Political Dispatch. We'll see you all next year.